Welcome to the Mountain Stories, Mountain Futures podcast. Our goal is to bring to light new stories and new perspectives on mountain landscapes and mountain communities around the world with help from a wide range of expert guests. We're looking at exciting new academic research on mountain history and some amazing work by creative practitioners engaging with mountain landscapes in a range of different media. I'm Jason König from the University of St Andrews.
And I'm Jonathan Pitches from the University of Leeds. It's a fantastic pleasure to welcome Harriet and Rob Fraser, collectively known as Somewhere Nowhere, an environmental art and research practice undertaken collaboratively using your skills as a writer and photographer respectively. You're creatively eclectic, I think it's fair to say, and use photography, poetry, art, walking practices and research to focus on what you identify as sensitive environments and cultures. And to do this, you work alongside scientists, farmers and analysts, as well as public organisations concerned with environmental work, landscape care and rural policies. For this podcast, obviously, we're going to be focusing on some of the sensitive mountain environments you've worked in, but your projects, we must note, are by no means constrained to the hills. Welcome, both of you. Fantastic to have you on the podcast, and thanks for taking the time to talk to us.
Hello, and great to meet you and talk to you today.
Can I just start with a question that we love to ask our podcast guests, which is how you came to work on or in the mountains? How did that relationship come about? Tell us a little bit about that.
I think for myself, like a lot of people who are attached to mountains, it started very early or at an earliest age, just to go walking in the spaces, really. Not with my family, because we weren't big walkers as a family, but I think once I got to a certain age and I realised that those spaces were available, then holidays in the Lake District in my sort of mid to late 20s were a norm, to get out there and actually experience those spaces. And that's how I came to love these places. I don't like hot places, so if it's a choice between a hot place and a cold place, I'd far rather go to a cold place. Cold, wet and windy in the case of Cumbria. I feel more at home in these environments than I would do on a beach somewhere, for instance.
And you, Harriet?
Yeah, I think for me, to trace it back, I think I have a lot to thank my dad for. He was a lover of walking in the mountains. Not big mountains like the Himalayas, but he loved Scotland and the Lake District and Wales. And from a very early age, he would have been doing that, but he got me involved when I was about 14, I think. I came away on a trip every year for 50 years. He was part of his old school mountaineering club, and they came to the lakes and Scotland once a year, every year. And he took me up Scafell, Bowfell and Skidder, all in the rain, and I could barely walk after that, but for some reason I was hooked. And I think that was where my love of the Lake District began.
That's a lovely story, both of you. Maybe if I could just sort of follow up a little on the relationship then to those Cumbrian spaces in you and your practice as practitioners. What's that connection point between Cumbria and your practice?
I think for me, I moved to Cumbria I was living in Manchester at the time, and I moved to Cumbria in 1995, and just thought I'd be here for a couple of years, but of course I'm still here now. Walking is, I think, fundamental to my well-being, and I love mountains. I'm not really a flatland type of person. And walking and being slow and the act of noticing are all really vital. And I record what I do through writing. I always have. So I think the two just came together naturally.
Yeah, I spent a year out in 2000. I had my gap year when I was 39. And took off around the world with my partner at the time. And when I returned, I'd moved out of Birmingham. I didn't want to move back to the city. I was living in the edge of the city there, doing a lot of corporate kind of work and PR work and all that, photography-wise. And I knew I didn't want to go back there. And it was a toss-up for me, or myself and my partner at the time, whether we moved to Exmoor or whether we moved to the Lake District. And we ended up in the Lake District, and I was hooked immediately. Just the space here. I think I like places where there's fewer people. That's not to say I'm a curmudgeon, but I don't really get on well in cities. I like going there and visiting there, but I love even more coming back. So to come back to Cumbria and sort of be here since 2003, this is home. This feels like home. And I deliberately moved to a space where there were big mountains, big empty spaces. And I suppose collaborative, myself and Harriet, we got together in 2009 and both realised that we loved the outdoors. We had a shared passion for the outdoors and realised quite quickly, actually, that we could combine our skills as a writer and a photographer, an image maker, to look at this place. And originally it started through just playing, how can we play as creative practitioners, looking at the places that we both love. And then that grew into an understanding or realization that maybe we could do something professionally, if you like, through that role. And that's how it began. We just started playing and realized that there was a real value in pairing up images and words, super additivity, that the sum of the parts are way more than the sum of the individual bits. So that's how we started playing from there.
Fascinating. And that notion of play, I think you've retained since that meeting point, and it's still there, evident in your documentation as well, and all the books that you've created around your projects. And I'm sure we'll dive into that. Before I hand on to Jason, just one question around your mountain guide experience and your previous identity. How has that shaped your creative practice, relationship to mountains more generally, Rob?
When I came back from my gap year, I knew people from KE Adventure Travel quite well, the directors there, Glenn and Tim, and they've been badgering me to actually join as one of their guides. And this is back in the day before it was paperwork laden. You could just rock up and guide. So I quite quickly earned my stripes, did a lot of trips, predominantly in mountain regions across the world. And I think that reinforced my love of these kind of spaces, these huge towering bases, full of rocks and full of cultures that are doing really well in some of these spaces. So my practice evolved because I always carried a camera with me. I had all the safety equipment when I was guiding these places, but I was also carrying one, maybe two big cameras so I could whip them out at a moment's notice and record the places. And that gradually evolved to more going away from sort of photographing the landscapes per se, which I always loved, into actually photographing the people that I met along the way. So I've collected over the last sort of 16, 17 years portraits, large format real film portraits of people in Nepal, in South America and Africa. So I've got quite a big collection now of people I've met and smiled at, and they've been willing to sort of stand in front of my camera. And just as a record of people who are entangled in these spaces, I've done that subsequently through a lot of the projects back here in the UK. And that's a nice collection that's been built up. No idea what I'll do with these images over time, but it'd be nice to actually get them out and show them. People in mountains, I think, has been going on forever. It seems like a hard place to live, but it also seems like a fulfilling place to live. It really does.
And the people are definitely shaped by their landscapes. And I think when you meet people who live in high places, tough places where the weather changes and you have extremes, there's a nice rawness and kind of openness that you don't feel maybe so much in the flatter lands.
I think because the living is harder, so people perhaps have to feel a slightly more humility in being in those spaces.
And constantly adaptive as well.
Yeah, you're not big and brash in the mountains too much. I think you just got to be gentle in those spaces for sure.
Just thinking about people and mountains, and from the outside you might see, a few houses or a small farm and think that it's very isolated, but the sense of community is very different because it can spread across entire mountain ranges, or in the UK it can spread across Dartmoor, Yorkshire, Northumberland, Cumbria, where that is actually one community, even though it's geographically separated. There's something about living in the higher spaces and doing the work that needs to be done there that connects people up. And there's a unique set of skills and an outlook that I think we both really have absolutely loved over the last 15 years, learning from people in those places and walking alongside them and sometimes working alongside them. It makes for a very different way of encountering the land. So you're not just walking on it, you're walking with it and with the culture and the history of those places.
Fantastic. Thank you. Jason.
Thanks. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear about the mountains as places of connection and community. That's a theme we've found emerging quite a lot in the different interviews we've done. Actually, we tend to think of mountains as isolated places, but often that's not the case, is it? They do connect people around them in all sorts of ways. So, yeah, we talked a bit about origins there. Can we take a step forward now and talk about Somewhere Nowhere, please? How was Somewhere Nowhere born? What are the origins of the name in particular? It's an amazing name. I think it really draws people in. What does the name say about your understanding of place?
Right. Okay. Well, I'll try and answer that. As Rob already said, we met in 2009. We first of all realised that we both loved walking in the hills and generally being outside. And then because we both had a creative practice, that inevitably we started playing with that together and realized we could do something with it. So we thought, okay, so what are we going to call ourselves? And we spent some time thinking up some names, most of which were really rubbish. And then this name came in sideways. There's a poet called Anne Stevenson, who's sadly no longer with us. She's known as an American poet, but she's from Durham. And she wrote a poem called Still Life in Utah that I encountered when I was 14. And the first line never, never left me. And it is somewhere, nowhere in Utah. And we sat with those words and we thought, gosh, that just has a lovely ring to it, somewhere, nowhere. And you can play with that phrase quite a lot because nowhere separates into now, here. Talking about mountains seemingly isolated, but when you know them, they're very connected. How a nowhere can become a somewhere when you're really either attentive to it as a visitor or you live in it and you're familiar with it. So there's lots of plays on the words. We got in touch with Anne, talked to her, said we'd like to use the name, met her, went and had cake with her. So there's a really lovely connection there. And the name seems to be fitting. It still seems to work.
It still seems really relevant to work with that name, if you like, because it still feels that we're being exposed to more and more places through hooking up with people across the UK and further afield that are nowheres to us until we start asking questions. And then somebody somewhere literally pops up and can bring light to a place, and it becomes definitely a somewhere to us then. And through the work that we do, hopefully we can bring a light on it to others and start spreading those ripples out a little bit further. So it's kind of worked really well for us over the years, without even realizing it. When you set something in motion, sometimes it can just continue fitting really well.
Yeah, and it's another kind of question or realization that's come up is also, the human perspective of what is a nowhere. Of course, it's a somewhere to another species. And so being mindful of that, I think, always inclines us to just pause and consider what a place means to a whole range of beings, not just the humans.
Fantastic. It's really interesting to hear you unpacking that. I mentioned to several people yesterday, actually, we were going to be having this conversation today, and they all zoomed in on the name and were asking about it. And so it clearly is something that catches people's attention. I had a quick dig into the poem yesterday, actually. I was really interested in the way in which the landscape that Anne Stevenson is describing in that poem, in some ways, is very, very different from the kind of landscape that you work at. It seems to be set in the desert, or imagine it in a kind of flat plain stretching ahead. And there are some mountains at the end of the poem, aren't there?
Yes, she says that's it, where mountains are clouds.
Yeah,
lightning,
in the distance,
but
where
no
mountains
rain.
are clouds. So
Yeah. Of course, I wanted always to go to Utah. And it finally became possible in 2019. Flew into Salt Lake City and then drove out. And there they were. The mountains were clouds above the salt flats. Yeah. And I'd always wanted to experience that large sky that she seemed to capture in that poem. And entirely different from Cumbria.
And I remember when we questioned her about the poem, Harriet in particular was keen to find out more about it and where she, what was going on there. And reported that she didn't know it was a drive-by. She was with her husband just driving through the U-turn, and she witnessed it as the car drove past whatever scene was happening by the side of the road. So she didn't know any more to the story than what she revealed in the poem, which I think is really, that's what art can do. It can just capture this sideways glimpse of a place and then bring it beautifully to life with perhaps more questions than there's answers there.
So she was curious and the poem left us curious, and we still haven't had our questions answered.
Great. Okay, well, that takes me nicely actually to the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is precisely about curiosity, because we'll talk in a minute about some specific projects, but just wanted to ask in general terms about the role of curiosity in your work, because it's something you talk about quite a lot. Is the importance of curiosity, is that one of the reasons why you talk about somewhere, nowhere, partly as a research practice, or is it more complicated than that?
It's probably definitely more complicated than that, or it's probably simpler than that, depending on which day we think about it. I think curiosity is our biggest tool. Certainly I describe that as my biggest tool, even before a camera. I've got to think about what's happening, what's going on, what if, what happens when, all those kind of questions before you actually pick up a camera and maybe capture it. So I've always been a curious sod, I've always been that kind of nosy person who wants to find out a little bit more. And I think since Harriet and I got together and started up the practice, I think that's only got more fierce, that curiosity. When you start asking questions, more questions crop up inevitably. And I think that's the joy of being human in a way, is you can start unpacking and unpicking things and then just going further and further into the weft and the weave of that cloth that you're looking at. And also, I think it's a privilege to be able to be curious. I don't, but anybody can do it. It's free to all. Never bored. I think that's something I thought of throughout my life. I've never been bored. I don't even know what bored means because I've always had something to do. And I think that possibly may be lost in the generations that are coming through at the moment. The younger generation, maybe their attention span is diminishing, sadly, due to devices. And the answer's always been on at the end of their hand, and I think that's a mixed curse and a blessing, that to have the answer immediately about everything, everywhere, all the time, I think is not going to do humanity much good in the long run. I think constantly asking questions and being exposed to the answers as you find them, I think is a real joy and a real privilege.
Yeah, I think if I just quickly add to that, I'm also naturally curious. If there's a path, I'm the one that will go off it.
That's because you're lost.
I love getting lost. Great. As long as I come back safely. But I think what happens is an increasingly frequent question that I ask and we both ask, or what don't we know and what does somebody else know? And I think the word research is quite an interesting word because perhaps that falls into an academic setting, but research, to re-look and to look and look and look again, or consider again and observe again, is really important, I think, for us. And when you go back to a familiar place again and again and again, but each time see it through a different lens or feel it through a different body or a different weather, that's part of research. And you asked Jason about research as part of our practice, and we do use that word quite intentionally because we use the practice of the art, whether it's photography or poetry creation or walking or ethnographic work, to find out more and to work with other people and have conversations that can help us find out more together. So consider that to be research, I think.
Mm.
Well, that sets us up really nicely to talk about some of your projects, the ones which, for this podcast at least, have a connection to high places and mountain landscapes. Could we start with the long view, going back to 2018? You describe it as meetings with 7 remarkably ordinary trees in Cumbria in all weathers, all seasons, night and day. How did that project come about? What did you want to achieve?
The long view came about quite naturally, he says, because he's not really telling the truth. We'd spent 2 years with farmers, upland farmers, on a project called Landkeepers, specifically in Cumbria, and realised how complex the landscape is here in Cumbria, the decision-making process and how farmers and other land managers work in this spaces. And we'd been brewing the idea of the long view for quite a few years before that. We got a book that's called The Big Book because it's big and it houses a lot of our projects. We had something called Seeing 7 Trees from a pub in Porlock down in Exmoor in 2010. So we had this notional idea of working with trees. We both love trees as well as these upland spaces. So we began playing with it then, and it seemed like naturally when we came out of finishing the Landkeepers project to then maybe pick up this tree project more seriously. And then we spent a bit more time trying to find the 7 trees, 7 different species spread out in an arc across Cumbria, which is harder than you think. The trees for me as a photographer needed to break the skyline. They needed to be on their own. They needed to look photogenic, and they needed to be different tree types, as I said, spread out across this arc across Cumbria. And we just really began from that notion. And then we spent about a year, I think it was, raising the funds to make it happen. And then finally it started in, I think it was about October 2015 when we actually began the 2 years of interrogation with the 7 trees and the spaces. And once again, that was another excuse for us to get out into the hills, into the fells, and go for walks to these trees repeatedly over that period, really. So it was a device, if you like, a creative device, but we didn't really know at the time how good it would be for us as practitioners to have that as a kind of experience and as a model for interrogating the place. It really ticked a lot of boxes for us, and we had to sort of stand up creatively. It taught us a lot of things that were a little bit on the edge in terms of doing, but I think we both came away really proud of that project. We achieved an awful lot from it, and it still stands the test of time now. And I think there's a space to the longer view, a project a bit further down the line when we go back and look at the trees and look at the issues we were looking at the time.
Yeah, so we spent the 2 years really getting to know these 7 individual trees by walking to them repeatedly, camping with them, sitting with them for a long time. I do a lot of slow, still kind of meditative practice as well. So we learned about the trees, and we had a lot of partners on that project, including the Woodland Trust, who at the time were leading a whole group of people in setting up the UK's new Charter for Trees, Woods and People. So we joined a conversation about trees and how trees fit with different landscapes, including upland landscapes, and how to bring about more tree cover. But as Rob says, the trees were a focal point for discussing connections across the landscape as well, and the upland landscape of Cumbria. So we carried on our inquiry and developed our own creative practice, did a bit more play, brought installation work more to the forefront of what we were doing, became more active with my poetry, experimenting more with how the photography and the poetry worked together. So it was a really formative time.
It's a delightful project insofar as I can experience it through the documentation and through your long view book. And that sense of the careful curatorial arrangement of image and word, is writ through every page. Harriet, would you mind just saying a little bit more about how you practice that relationship between your writing and the landscape, and what that meditative moment might be doing, or moments might be doing in that creative space for you? You sort of demystify what's happening as you sit by the tree. Or not. You might just want to resist that entirely.
I think it's always I find it quite challenging to describe what I do, because perhaps most creative practitioners have this, because you just get on and you just do it. But if I'm walking or standing, I have a kind of a discipline to get writing and write what I notice, and to write very much in the present tense, and to not worry. It's very much a flow of consciousness, and I can write quite quickly on my phone, even while walking, if the ground's not too tricky. So that's quite fun. So that's one part of it, to gather notes, and I have quite prolific notes. But when I do the more meditative practice with the trees, which in other projects I'll do in other situations as well, I draw on my own experience of meditation and yogic practice, and tuning into different energy points in my body, trying to get myself settled and to reduce the noise of my own thoughts, and to tune into the connection between my physical body and the physical space around me, the earth and the tree and all of the sounds. And that can take quite a long time sometimes, but it's like anything. The more you practice it, the quicker it can come. And usually when I've quieted my own thoughts, something arises, some unexpected set of words or an insight or a new question. And for me, it helped me deepen my relationship with those trees and ask questions out, including being stuck with the creative practice. What am I going to do next? And something comes out of that. And sometimes it's a poem or a sketch, but there'll be words of some sort. Yeah.
I recognise a lot of those approaches and sensitivities as a theatre and performance practitioner. One's often asking performers and actors to get into that same kind of space of meditative creativity and responsiveness, actually, to environment. So it's a territory I think I understand a little of. You mentioned a little earlier, and we talked right at the beginning of this interview about your relationship to partners. With the long view, you've mentioned already a couple of your partners that came through. Could you say just a little bit more, either directly through the landscape of that project or more generally about that partnership working, how they emerge, how you choose them, they choose you, and the extent to which they become part of your creative ecology?
Do you want to go with that?
Yeah, I think quite often when we give talks, which we do fairly frequently, we use one slide that shows 3 words: curiosity, relationships and time. And I think they're the 3 pillars, if you like, of our practice. This innate curiosity to find out more, specifically in the context of rural spaces. I think we're big on rural spaces and the environment and the culture of place. But, we're always keen to build the relationships with people on the ground, and that could be farmers, or it could be foresters, or it could be conservation groups or land managers or people in charge of these spaces like national parks and people like Natural England. So I think by widening the circle of people that we hear from, work with, then it better serves the kind of information we're trying to bring in and then put out. And we try and do it in a way as objective as possible. We don't judge. We have our opinions about how land might be or could be going forwards, but we try not to put that too much on place. And I think we just reach out to people. We'd love to work with certain organizations. So we ask, we're not afraid of reaching out by email or whatever ways we can to get through to people to say we're going to be doing this. Are you interested in coming on board? And sometimes that helps with funding, because we're freelance. We need to make the money somehow. But other times people will approach us now, because we've been on the bus long enough now for people to actually come and offer up projects that they think we might be good to bring in on. It's heartening to see that creatives are now being brought in at a much earlier phase on these research projects rather than in the past where they might be brought in at the end to make the document look a bit nicer. So I think that it's come of a time where creative folk who are intrinsically linked with places, with environments, are being asked to come on board as proper researchers in their own right. And that's just snowballed. That's got exponential in a way. So that's heartening. And also we like hearing from different people who have a different lens to bring to a subject, to bring to a place. And I think that really brings the work more to life if we see that it comes from lots of different perspectives, and they're always complex. I think that's the problem that is built into these subjects. It's a complex, complicated area when you look at rural spaces and how they may be managed. But that you shouldn't shy away from that. Try and make it as readable and understandable across multiple audiences as possible, but understand that it is complex and complicated, and we just keep going with that and keep ploughing along.
Yeah, and I think we trace a lot back to that original project we did together, Landkeepers, when we set off thinking we were going to write really, learn from upland farmers, very quickly realised that it's an ecology of people in a complex upland landscape. And to bring that ecology into the projects we do makes absolute sense, because we learn from so many different people and doors get opened. If you want to do an artwork somewhere, you need to know the landowner, you need to know the farmer that works there, and have consultations. And it can take a few years to set up even a small intervention, but relationships are critical to that. So we're constantly learning from people and involving them. They get involved in our thinking, they prod us to go in a certain direction, and we just continue to have great conversations.
Great, really interesting to hear that. Yeah, we talked a bit there about your practice, Harriet, as a writer, and the way in which the landscape shapes that in relation to walking practices, meditation practices. I just had a question following up on that for Rob about photography, a kind of parallel question to that, just to be great to hear a little bit more about what are the particular challenges you face as a photographer in, I was going to say capturing mountains, but actually that's not the right verb to use. That's a very kind of anthropocentric verb, but working with the mountains perhaps.
Yeah, quite a long time ago, I described myself as making a picture rather than taking a picture. And I think it comes from Susan Sontag's literary take on how photography is perceived. You make an image, it's almost like you ask of it. The obvious pitfalls, challenges, I suppose, are the weather, trying to work with delicate electronic equipment in sometimes quite harsh and challenging conditions, as I know, can be a bit ruinous to your photographic gear. But I've always preferred mountains when they're gloomy, when they're a bit wet, when they're a bit lowering, the clouds are a bit down. Blue skies and mountains for me is too chocolate box and too nice. It's great to go walk in those kind of places, but they don't sing mountain for me. They don't sing upland spaces. I think mountains by their very nature are better suited when they're covered in cloud, they're covered in snow, they're covered in mist. And that's when it feels like, paradoxically, they come alive. They seem better suited to that kind of weather. If I take a photograph of a mountain and it's shouting gloom, doom, weather, then I've kind of been successful. But allied to that is light. It needs to have a strong sense of light playing across that field at all as well. A lot of my work now is digital. I use Nikon gear, which is great. And the stuff that you can do with that is amazing now in terms of the software at the back end. But I still really like working in real film, particularly with large format cameras. I shoot a lot of the stuff on an old fashioned cloth over the head 5x4 plate camera. And I really enjoy that slowing down process. I don't make many images because it's too expensive. It's quite expensive to have the film bought in the first place, but also to then print it. But there's a certain quality that comes on the back of using that camera, both with the people in the mountainscapes, but also with the landscape itself, that you don't get from digital. It's a lot tougher to work with that kind of kit, with that kind of format, than it is with digital. And it's kind of a bit more back to my stubborn nature in trying to make things a little bit more challenging, a little bit more difficult by lugging this big gear into these spaces. I feel I'm more ready for the taking of the shots if I've had to struggle a bit to get to these places than if I've just strolled up there and got a camera out and taken a few snaps. It feels a bit more in my own personality, more real if I've had to work hard to get some of those pictures.
Great to get the sense of the very different things you're doing, both individually within your own practice, but the way in which they combine into something which is even more than some of its parts, I guess. Is there anything else you wanted to say, Harriet, about your own practice in relation to the role of walking, for example?
I think from my perspective, my moving body thinks in a way that my static body doesn't. So not to say that I can't sit down and write something when I'm still, but moving unlocks something and eases the flow. And particularly, even though I get really grumpy on day 2 or day 3, a multi-day walk is just fantastic. And sometimes the process of not writing, the moments of not writing, or the days of not writing are really an important part of whatever writing does eventually happen. So walking to the extent that you're actually not really thinking anymore and you're just a very physical, spiritual being is a really big part of what words come out eventually. So we did a 16-day walk for one project, and I think, came out with a 4-line poem at the end, but
I would like to add about the walking as well is the fact that we don't talk a lot when we're actually walking. Not to say we're antisocial, but I think we get into our own little zones. We're perfect walking partners. Sometimes we get invited to go on walks with mates and we think, Jesus, I couldn't imagine anything worse, because all they're going to do is yabber at us, talk at us, and we're not experiencing the space as we'd like to. Sometimes it's actually quite nice to take other folk that we know, friends and relatives, up into the mountains, but more often than not, that's for a different purpose.
It's a different walk, isn't it?
Yeah, the actual business, if you like, of being in a space is far more better suited to my nature to be done quietly, to be done in a thoughtful way. And it may be I'm just thinking about the chores that need to be done at home or what have you, but quickly, not far away from the car or the vehicle or whatever it is, you lose that sense of what needs to be done and you become more present in that space. You have to be more attentive to where you're putting your feet, to what's going on around you, to the weather. Am I warm enough or am I cold? Are my feet wet? Is my gear okay? What am I seeing over there? So you gradually allow yourself to be open to that space, because we don't actually talk that much when we're out in the fells.
No, we have a discipline, especially for multi-day walks, that we won't look at the news or put the radio on or engage with anything, because in the UK it's really easy to be hooked up all the time. In the Himalayas you may not have the opportunity of being connected, but to just intentionally disconnect and be fully in the walking experience is a really important part of those longer walks. And the world's still there when you get back, It's fine.
Usually it's still there.
Yeah, of course. Fantastic, thanks. One of the other things I'm really curious about is the longer history of the landscapes that you work in, because obviously the Cumbrian landscape has this very long, very well-known history of poetic, artistic engagement stretching back into the 18th century, I guess. I've talked to other artists who work in the Lake District in Cumbria who even have expressed frustration about that, and the sense that you've got these hordes of tourists turning up, all of whom know a little bit about Wordsworth, coming to these landscapes with their own preconceptions. Do you think about that history in your own work? Do you share those frustrations? Do you have a sense that you're reacting to that history or reacting against it? Or is it just in the background for you?
That's a good question. I think back in around 2015, I was doing an MPhil at Glasgow University, considering the Lake District as a cultural landscape through the medium of poetry, and particularly kinetic poetry and moving poetry. And I remember not really kicking back, but thinking, okay, so putting poems on the back end of sheep or strapping words to trees or something is quite different from the lyrical poetry of Wordsworth. But that would be reasonably superficial. And actually, I think that heritage of the writing, but also the process that goes behind the writing, which is the noticing. And Dorothy Wordsworth, for example, in her journals of really noticing the ordinary and walking being a necessary part of that, and being slow and acknowledging the weather. I think that's really valuable, and it's an integral part of the Lake District. It's part of its World Heritage Site status. And I think Rob used the words weft and weave before, and I think those past artists and writers, Coleridge, Wordsworth, Turner, they are part of how this place is perceived. I'm not really frustrated. I think people have so many different ways of encountering a place. And if it opens a door for them, then that's a good starting point.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. That's still actually quite a powerful legacy for you.
I did work with the Wordsworth Trust for a while, so I had a real privilege of hanging out with the collections and some of the incredible curators there. But I like the women in the story.
I think it's good as well that, and it's only natural when you look at a place like the Lake District and how fantastically gorgeous it is, that others will have been entangled with it in creative ways throughout history. We're just another rollout of that rug of people who are responding to it through creative lenses, if you like. And I think that's great and that's fine. I don't feel the need to rail against that or rage against that at all. I think it's great that it's celebrated.
Yeah, and it's not all romantic. And Wordsworth and his contemporaries were not all romantic either. They were highlighting problems and issues, and that's still an important role for artists to talk about, not the chocolate box and the calendar images, but really what's going on behind, and where's good stuff happening and where does more work need to be done to look after these places.
Yeah, and they were the radicals of their own time in their own ways. You know, they weren't just looking at the mountain landscapes through rose-tinted spectacles. You know, they were looking at social issues, revolution, literally, in Wordsworth's case. So, you know, power to them, you know, for actually staying at their cause and finding that creative response to encapsulate this beautiful landscape that we all know that definitely still has its challenges. You know, the challenges have changed for sure, but they've always been here and they always will be here. It's just how they're dealt with, I suppose.
Could we move to a later project? I'm thinking of Sense of Here, and perhaps just to get you to unpack the idea behind the 12 canvases as a conceit into that project, and just a big shout out for how well you've documented this and how excellent the website is. It was a fantastic film. There's a Data of the Heart map. There's a blog. It's really beautifully complex but carefully coordinated. How does that come about? Could you just take us through the steps?
Gosh, again, it was a bit like the Longview project, which started off as seeing 7 trees. We had this idea tickling away at the back of our minds about how on earth do you begin to encounter this landscape with consideration of the many different demands made on it and the different lenses and the different levels of understanding. And we became involved in a project that was led through a team at Lancaster University called Ensemble, and they were looking at IT and the Internet of Things and how to bring different understandings together in the management of landscape, and brought us along as artists. And their languages are almost unintelligible to us. Some of them.
What do you mean almost?
Okay, yeah. Very in-depth scientific, analytical and modelling practices. But we wanted to bring it back to being grounded and in a particular place. So we decided to develop this idea, again, build on our walking practice and our knowledge of people and place in Cumbria, and set up this clock face and divide it into 12 sections. And so for each month of the year, we'd walk around the clock face in a particular section and look at a particular issue, whether that's soil or tourism or farming or well-being. And the canvas came in as a poetic device, and we had people respond to a survey, and that read the Data of the Heart map. And it was a really, really fascinating process of inquiry and research for us, again, through walking and through talking to people, interviewing people. And it started off as really kind of feeding into that multidisciplinary team, looking at understanding place from different perspectives and understanding complexity in landscape management. So it was an inquiry process, and I'll hand over to Rob now because we were cut short midway by COVID. So everything we had planned for the next 2 years of the project didn't happen. So it's unfinished business that I think we'll come back to. But we did make the film, we did the long walk, we had an exhibition.
Both of us like challenge ourselves a little bit further. So the idea of the canvas came up. We were in I think it was a little house in the Isle of Mull, and we got the big project out. It was a wettish week, and we when we go on holiday, we take the big book. You take the big book, and we sort of plan out another idea. So part of the time is spent working generally, and the other time is spent drinking beer and walking, which is a great holiday. It's my perfect holiday, to be honest. And we had this idea of sensor here, the clock face as a device, started falling into place, and it literally builds on those ideas of previous projects we worked on. So our projects are iterative. So all the ideas and all the relationships we've built, we like to carry on in some way if we can. And the canvas, we decided during each of those months, January through to December, we'd place it in a certain space somewhere in that wedge. It had to go in a place. It was quite challenging. We found out by February, anything more than a light zephyr and this thing that you put up that's not very wind resistant is likely to fall over. And so it did. So some of the letters off earth, land, sky blew into Oldswater, and we had to wade in and go and get these letters back out and put them back on again and move the canvas a bit further down. But, it was such a joy, and I'm so proud of the fact that we saw it all the way through, and it carries a poem. So the canvas is exactly the same, but each month Harriet would take the letters off and put a different set of words on the canvas. So it carried all the way through this poem, if you like. I'm not sure if you call it a poem.
Yeah, well, that was really where the canvas was born, and we still use it a lot as a provocation. And we also treated the idea of camping as an installation, which we were part of, and we had to camp very specifically on a very specific line. So there was a lot of compass work.
Yeah, on every 30-degree line. Like January, we were on the 30-degree line, camped up by Grisdale Tyne in the snow. -8, putting our tent up and then getting up in the morning to catch the sunrise on Helvell Inn. February, we were on the 60-degree line that went across Hartefell, I think it was. So we chased that around the whole year. It didn't make for a comfortable month, to be honest, because we knew every month we had to do something. We're looking at the weather, looking at the wind, looking at the rain, and just working out when we can do that and interview 50 plus people as part of the project to imbue all this knowledge from all these different experts. So we took on the challenge and really enjoyed it. But as Harriet said, it got cut short because obviously COVID came along and all the plans, that the what next, had to sort of slightly fall by the wayside. But we still think that there's enough in the project methodology and the project ideas to revisit. So we're thinking about, from January next year, going back into the spaces where the canvas was, to rethink what we felt at that time and repackage, repurpose perhaps new ideas, new thoughts that come into our heads.
It was a very particular time in politics as well, because we were going through the Brexit decisions at the time.
I remember that.
Yeah, so and we're in a kind of a different space in terms of climate change statistics, politics, what's happening around the world, and it will be good to rethink perspective on a local level in relation to what's going on nationally and internationally.
Yeah. Unfinished business.
Great. Can I just jump in actually with a quick follow? I think it's a quick follow-up question. We'll see, which is really just hearing you talk there about that camping experience high up in these cold mountain landscapes. I'm just wondering really how important the category of the mountain is for your work, because obviously a lot of the time I guess you're focusing in on very local spaces. You're spending time together with your trees on quite a localized level. Is the idea of the mountain important for your work, or is it just a background presence? And I suppose there's another question lying behind that, which is what even is a mountain for you and for the regions you work in?
It's a difficult one because I'm particularly drawn to those kind of spaces, those geological features which might be described as mountains, but it's not because they're mountains, if that makes sense. I just like that kind of feeling of wide open spaces, and they don't tend to be built up as a consequence of that. And I do like weather. I think if Britain's got anything going for it, it's like weather changing on a daily basis. We talk about it. It becomes the first point of conversation for us, about the weather today. And of course, that's probably more exacerbated if you're living or working in these mountain landscapes, which get a lot of weather. So I don't necessarily personally feel them as being mountains. It's just places that I go to that happen to be a bit upland, a bit bumpy, a bit rocky, a bit surrounded by these spaces. And as I said before, I think I like the challenge of being in places like that are a bit hard and a bit uncomfortable, and making yourself comfortable in these spaces. I think that's the important bit. I don't go out there deliberately to be uncomfortable. I go up there deliberately to challenge myself, and by dint of both of us going there, both of us being comfortable in those spaces or being able to deal with the challenge of being in those places. I think it just makes me feel more alive. If it's quite hard going, if it's hard to put a tent up in a sort of 60-mile-an-hour wind and it's pissing it down with rain, I think that feels like a nice thing to be able to do and a privilege to be able to do. So yeah, I just see them as challenging spaces that are a bit rocky and a bit uppy rather than mountains per se.
Yeah, mountain, it's an interesting term, isn't it? And I think there are lots of different heights. So the fells we have here in Cumbria are pretty small. I've also spent a fair bit of time in the Himalayas and been wowed by the size of them. I think going uphill is just wonderful. I love it. Even if it's tough, to walk uphill is much more satisfying than a flat walk. And there is something that I think is perhaps specific to mountains, maybe particularly the exposed areas of mountains, which is a sense of time that's just unique. And it comes from the rocks, it comes from the way the light is, it comes from the perspective you can get or the view you can get from a high place. You can't see everything. You can see the tops of things, but you don't know what's down below either. So there's also that curiosity. But there is something about the time and the geology. I wish I knew more about the geology, but it is fascinating how many different ages and types of rocks there are, even in this tiny place that's Cumbria. And you've got the bottom of what used to be the ocean is now on the top of a mountain, and you can go and see the fossils there. People used to quarry there thousands of years ago. That for me is that lovely feeling of age you don't get anywhere else. And that combined with the scale of being isolated on top of a hill and perhaps in a 50-mile-an-hour wind kind of forces a rethink of our place and how big or small we are. Completely insignificant as an individual, but yet as a species, look what we're doing. So I just find it very inspirational in terms of a bit of the more philosophical way of considering life.
A friend of ours has got an art practice. I might be paraphrasing here, but it's all about the places we go to feel small. And I think that's what mountains are all about. It's the edge of the possible, really. Because I think man has been really good at being everywhere, managed to get a foothold everywhere, but yet it's still tough in those kind of challenging places. But yet they've adapted to it in a ways that suit them. But I think there's not many other habitats like this where you can just feel like you're on the edge of possible a lot of the time. And I think mountains definitely give that. And for some people, that makes them feel really alive. I don't think I'd like to try and make a living out of working in a mountain landscape, but I do really enjoy looking at them as a creative person to try and get something back and repurpose and re-put out into the world in a way that makes other people understand how beautifully challenging these spaces are.
If we could just zoom out a little, I'm really curious, and perhaps this is my own selfishness running a place research group, about your place collective and you being founder members and wanting to know a little bit more about this and its relationship to Somewhere Nowhere, maybe how we could get involved, what the things are that are going on and the aspirations of this collective.
So back in the early 2020s, we were thinking, how could we extend our community? What even is our community? And we talked about this for a long time and then realised it was perhaps specifically creative practitioners whose artwork is not just responsive or reflective of the environment, but interested in what's going on there and environmental change and the ecology of places. And we had a lot of conversations with a professor called Chris Loynes at the University of Cumbria, where the Centre for National Parks and Protected Areas sits. And over time, we kind of thought, how could this work? And we came up with the Place Collective, which stands for People, Land, Art, Culture and Ecology. And we set that up so that artists could become involved in multidisciplinary teams, which was involved in research and engagement and action around landscape care and change. And that became something in 2021. And since then, we've run a number of events, bringing different specialists together, but also become involved in projects that are multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary, working with practitioners who aren't even in the academic institutions. And bringing art into the conversation has been really rewarding, hasn't it? There's more than 40 artist members at the moment. We're kind of at a little stage of, we're 5 years old now, so we're having a little bit of a think about where do we go next. But Rob, maybe you want to say a bit about the projects.
once you make yourself visible, then it's not surprising that people attach yourself, come to you. I think the research world, the academy has been crying out for places to find out where they can get hold of artists, because you can't necessarily assume that every researcher all of a sudden has been asked to bring a creative into a team, knows where to find these people. So without us even realizing it, by setting up a space where we've become a little bit more visible, we now get sort of people come to us and see if we can come in on a bid or on a pitch, which is great. So we've been able to sort of share the love and bring in specific artists who've got a specific skill that we think would fit in with the project, and then sort of pass them on. We don't get any money through being the Place Collective. We get sort of funded through the project specifically that we get involved in. As Harriet said, we've done the 5-year bit now. We're just renegotiating what the next terms are with the University of Cumbria. They've got a new director at the Centre for National Parks and Protected Areas who's really energised and wants to actually make it more of a bigger thing than it has been over the past few years. And that's great, because it gives us a bit more of an ambition, if you like, to show the role of artists as researchers in research settings. So we're just trying to work out what the next few years looks like. We've got a steering group now made up from the artist members. There's about 9 of us on that who can help us, so it's not us holding it all the time, help with the direction, the what next. And it's good. We meet barely on an ad hoc basis, about 3 or 4 times a year online for about an hour and a half, and just chew the fat and just all get together and just say what's on our minds or on our plate at the moment. Can we share these examples? Can we share the experience? Can we learn from another? Because most artists are working on their own. They're individual in their own little world, getting on with their own little things, and it's nice to be able to open up and in a really warm way, I think, to just work out how we can work at these grand challenges together, I think.
Yeah, and we've managed to get pure funding for a number of projects that have involved multiple artists bringing different disciplines together. So we've worked on a project focused on a peat bog that's undergoing restoration. We've worked on a project in the Ullswater watershed, and the Place Collective is currently involved in a UK-wide project which involves the governments of all 4 nations in a very grand quest to try and find pathways and scenarios that will enable the land use sector to get to net zero by 2050. So there's 34 different organisations involved in that, but the Place Collective is part of that, which means that there are artists who can come in and this in a number of different ways. And I think essentially it helps to just influence conversations, steer conversations, help with relationship building, and bring the abstract and the theoretical down to the ground level and what it is to actually walk and be in a farmed or a forested landscape. So we're trying to bring these different components together, and still evolving as a collective.
It's a really inspiring project and story. I mean, I can't help but think of some of the other interdisciplinary spaces I've occupied, and as you alluded to earlier, the artist's contribution to those spaces is often marginalised. It's often considered to be, as you say, that kind of final bit of glitzy documentation and public relations stuff. And we all know from an arts background how fundamentally more important the contribution is for artistic thinking. And it seems from what you've described that you've got a caucus there, a very significant caucus of artistic thinking, and the interdisciplinary work that sits around that is perhaps properly hierarchized, that there's an appropriate relationship between that artistic thinking and some of the stuff that goes on in STEM. It's fantastic. Thanks for letting us know about that.
Well, if you can help with any of the evaluation processes, we'll be really happy, because what actually happens when the artists get involved and what are the impacts it's quite hard. You need a lot of time to show that, and I think that's happening more and more. There's more and more eyes on this in the kind of academic realm, but you'll be well placed to be researching that at the moment.
Also, I think it's fair to say that artists aren't special. They just do something different. And I think something different is really important in spaces where the same way of looking at things over the decades has got us to here, good, bad or indifferent. So if we think we need to address certain challenges in terms of the environment, in terms of land use, in terms of relationships with land, then we need to bring in a lot more actors into the space to actually properly work out how we get through this entanglement together. So I think what artists are really good at doing, and I think we really want to do it, is to shorten the distance between the decisions being made at policy level and the people at the ground who are delivering those actions. I think there's a huge gap. And I think when you get into the uplands where we're based, it's even huger, if that's a proper word, between what happens at a policy level at Westminster and what happens in a quiet valley in the middle of the Lake District. And I think if the people who are making those decisions recognise the challenges that are real and apparent on a daily basis, then they might be more inclined to think slightly differently. And I think, it's not just a case about money. It certainly is not just a case about funding. I think it's just an understanding about the rural spaces and how that is an integral part of the community life. It's not just a business for a farm in the middle of the Lake District. It's the cultural aspect and their placement in that community, and how important it is that farmers are still recognised as being an invaluable part of that community. Whether you agree with sheep farming or not, I think having people who work that landscape is still worth shouting about and still worth preserving and valuing, and not just as a romantic, tokenistic farmer on the gate sucking a piece of straw kind of way, for a museum piece for the tourists to stare at. It's about this way that we work with land and get the soil under our fingernails and feel the weather and feel that sense of history on our backs about, what's gone before.
Finally, I thought we could just look ahead to the future, if you're willing. You talked a little bit about possible futures in your own research plans, your own artistic practice, but I wonder if we could just talk for a few minutes more broadly about the future possibilities for the Cumbrian hills and fells that you work in. What do you think are the challenges facing that landscape? Where do we look for positive, hopeful stories about the kind of possible futures that we can build for the landscapes of Cumbria, perhaps more broadly for mountain landscapes, mountain communities in the UK and beyond?
Gosh, that's a big question to close with. I don't know if you've been tuning into the news recently. Well, recently actually could be the last 10 years, but it's particularly challenging at the moment, given that a lot of the landscape is farmed. The majority of the landscape is under the care of farmers. There's a lot of uncertainty around farming at the moment in terms of the way that government policy has changed since the UK came out of the European Union, and we lost a common agricultural policy. So governments since then have been trying to put new schemes into place, and there are some really positive moves, but what's actually worrying for farmers is that there's a massive drop in income, and for some people that's not sustainable anymore. And if that's the case and there is some abandonment of farms, I think that will be a real challenge to these areas. On the plus side, there are a lot of individual farmers out there who are doing great work, many of them in collaboration with their neighbours or with landowners or NGOs like the National Trust and National Park authorities. Really great work to continue farming livestock, but in a way that is nature friendly. So increasing wood pasture, doing more kind of conservation grazing type methods so that you're getting a healthier landscape and you're getting a healthier animal and for people who eat meat, you're getting much better quality meat. And, the landscape has evolved with humans and animals and trees and flowers and grass and all of that all together for thousands and thousands of years. So to come back to a balanced way of working would be the ideal. We're really keen to find ways to be able to give a bit more of a platform to a lot more positive stories so that knowledge and the ingredients for success can be shared more widely. And maybe, art is one way of doing that. There are a lot of challenges and a lot of doomy stories out there, but I see positive stuff happening and farmers forming CICs and groups to upskill themselves and to really get on the front foot when it comes to change, with a determination that says we've been here for hundreds of years, we're happy to change and adapt, but we really know this place, and to try and not lose their agency in the face of political pressures.
I think there's a lot of challenges in the mountain landscapes at the moment, or the uplands, or the fells, as we would call them here in Cumbria. But maybe that's always been the case. I'm hoping that it's evolution again rather than revolution. Revolution possibly might not be a good thing. I think that idea of abandonment may happen, perhaps not in the Lake District so much because the National Trust owns so many of the farms. They've got quite a few tenant farmers, but certainly as some of the more socially deprived upland areas of England in particular, I think there's a real fear that some of those farming families will have to let go, if they can't no longer do it. The idea that they can farm their way out of a crisis, which is perhaps what they've tried to do in the past, I think will become even more challenging with the payment schemes, with the climate. It's making it harder to make a living in these spaces. I think there was a report came out just a few days ago, a small sample, admittedly, but still said that just over a third of farmers were just about breaking even or making a loss, and only about 10% farmers were making actually a good profit. So farmers are viewed from the outside as being fairly wealthy, but a lot of their cash is tied up in the land or in the buildings. They don't actually make a huge income. And I think a lot of farmers also, certainly here in the upland areas, don't count the hours they put in. So the income will be whatever money comes through the door, but they don't actually account for the hours they spend out there on the fells doing what needs to be done on a daily basis. And I think that needs to be somehow recognised and brought to the fore more. The mountains will still be the mountains. They're not going anywhere. They're adapting, perhaps not as quick as they need to given the climatic changes, but there'll still be a space where the land will be still that kind of way. But how it looks on the surface, how it's viewed by the 19 million tourists we get here in Cumbria, on an annual basis, may change. I really don't know.
Yeah, and we've touched on farming, but beyond the people who are farmers within these communities, there's so many people who are passionate about looking after their place. There's an upswell in citizen science and people monitoring and looking at how they can connect better and improve like tree cover or biodiversity or opportunities for other species to thrive, improve water quality. There's all these different elements, and my optimism is that there are more and more people who are keen to become involved and to help. So as long as that's nurtured and made possible I'm not going to start talking about the system, because sometimes you think the system itself does need to change. But if you look at the smaller pieces and the individual people and the communities, there's a lot of great work going on.
I understand you might have a little surprise for us at the end of the podcast, which is a poem from Harriet. Would you like to read that for us?
Thank you. I will. I'll share this poem, which I wrote at the end of the Sense of Here walk that we did, linking up the 12 canvases. And it was a few hundred kilometres and 16 days. This small skin-held society, my body, feels its way over grass and stone, leans into wind, an ecology of muscles, sinews, joints, eyes, feet. Knees find consciousness. Pain rises, then eases, like a river after rain. Day by day, body takes over mind, shows what it knows, learns as it goes. When weariness sets in, the mind compels those final necessary movements to fix up home, to make food, to eat. Then, lying flat, the body lets go, muscle by muscle, tendon and nerve, relaxes into healing. And over time, like land weathered, the body finds its strongest form, to be upright and certain in the face of a storm.
Thank you. That's a wonderful way to finish.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Harriet. Thank you, Rob, for a really inspiring conversation. Thank you to Sophia Gertin for editing. We've got more episodes coming up, exploring new perspectives on mountain history and mountain experience. If you enjoyed this episode, please do share our podcast with others. Have a look at our other episodes. You can follow us on social media or get in touch directly via the project website. Just search for Mountain Stories, Mountain Futures, or follow the links in the episode notes. Thank you for listening.